They thought we were prey, soft, slow, emotional, the kind of species that builds cozy homes, sings to the stars, and dreams of peace. To the Zarn, we were perfect targets, unarmed, unaware, unworthy. So when their bone ships appeared in orbit over outpost Theta 9, no one expected what came next. The Zarn were known throughout the Orion Spur as apex predators, 7 feet tall, clawed, cold, blooded. They lived for the hunt. Their civilization didn't revolve around commerce or diplomacy. It revolved around dominance. Every first contact was a test, and every test ended the same, with blood, trophies, and another species added to their long list of conquered prey. So when they arrived at Theta 9, a fledgling Terran research colony with minimal defenses, they assumed it would be easy. A quick strike, a clean kill, glory for the hunt. They underestimated what they found. The first landing squad touched down in the Preed. On ours, the air was thick with humidity, the jungle damp and teeming with life. Zarn scouts moved silently, their thermal vision scanning for heat signatures. The human settlement was just ahead, a cluster of prefabricated domes surrounded by a light energy fence, laughable defenses. No drones. No orbital shields. The signal to attack was given, but something was off. The scouts had barely moved 10 meters when one of them vanished. No sound, no struggle, just gone. The Zarn paused. Recalibrated sensors, then moved again. Another one vanished. This time there was a sound, a soft whump like compressed air. Then silence. Panic was not a concept the Zarn were familiar with, but unease. That was new. The remaining squad activated combat vision, motion trackers, scanned for electromagnetic signatures. Still nothing. Then the lights flickered, and the screaming began. The humans hadn't run. They hadn't hidden. They were waiting. Not soldiers, not marines, just researchers, engineers, technicians. But they had armed themselves with crude slug throwers, improvised flame weapons, and worst of all, traps, pits lined with polymer spikes, tripwires connected to pressurized gas tanks, narrow kill zones built from crates and mining equipment. The colony hadn't been abandoned. It had been turned into a hunting ground. For them, the Zarn tried to retreat, but every path was blocked, every movement watched, every mistake punished. One Zarn survivor, if you could call him that, was recovered 3 days later, half delirious. Missing an arm, clawed marks on his own flesh, signs of self-mutilation. He kept repeating a phrase in broken trade. Tongue, they don't sleep, they don't stop, they waited for us. He died hours later from shock. The Zarn assumed it was a fluke, bad intel, a miscalculation. So they sent another squad, then a third. By the time they realized the truth, 10 elite hunting units had been lost on Theta 9, and not one human body was found. They had learned our weakness was supposed to be rest, downtime, the need to sleep. They didn't understand that humans, when driven, when cornered, can override that need with pure will. That we are a species capable of staying awake for days, fueled by anger and caffeine and adrenaline and the desire for revenge. That our strength isn't just in our weapons, it's in our minds, in our refusal to stop. The Zarn came to hunt. They left whispers, whispers of things in the dark, of prey that stares back, of humans who smiled through the blood and kept moving. It was no longer a hunt, it was war. And they had picked the wrong prey. They called us unnatural, even among the many strange species that litter the stars. Not because of how we looked, no. By galactic standards, humans were physically unremarkable. No claws, no armor, no venom, nothing obvious that screamed danger. That was their mistake. The Zarn weren't the first to make it, but they were the first to pay in blood. See, most intelligent life evolved from prey animals. Species that developed teamwork, awareness, communication, all to avoid being eaten. That's what made them cooperative, peaceful, fearful, but humans didn't come from prey. Not really. We came from persistence hunters. From creatures that didn't ambush, didn't sprint, didn't roar. We chased, relentlessly, across deserts, through heat, for hours, sometimes days. Our ancestors stalked animals until their hearts burst from exhaustion. Until they simply gave up. We inherited that, not in muscle or claw, but in something deeper, something in our brains, in our blood. That's what the Zarn didn't understand. They watched our battles and couldn't believe what they saw. The first engagements weren't just violent, they were inhuman. Human Marines went 3, sometimes 4 days without rest. No sleep, no downtime, just coordinated, brutal efficiency. When alien troops would retreat to regroup, humans pursued. When the Zarn tried to ambush us at night, they found fireteams already awake, alert, waiting for them in perfect silence. We fought like we didn't need rest, like we were machines made of hate and caffeine. But it wasn't just endurance, it was obsession. A Zarn bioobserver, a field neuros specialist trained to analyze the psychological state of prey, once studied a captured human soldier. The man had broken 3 ribs, lost half his squad, and had been awake for nearly 72 hours when captured. He still tried to bite through his restraints, not for escape, but because he wanted to kill the one who had shot his comrade. He fights like a berserker, the observer wrote. But he plans like a tactician. His heart rate adapts to stress. His pain tolerance fluctuates based on emotional focus. His sleep deprivation should render him delirious, yet he becomes more focused, more dangerous. His mind enters a state of controlled madness. They called it madness because they had no other word for it. They didn't understand rage mixed with discipline. They didn't understand mourning mixed with focus. They had never encountered a species where grief was fuel. We're the only known sentients that can enter a flow state, that zone where action becomes instinct not during peace, not in meditation, but in combat, while dying, while killing. Our emotions don't make us weak. They make us limitless, so while they slept, we planned. While they healed, we improved. And when they came back, expecting us to be broken or exhausted, they found humans who had transformed suffering into strategy, loss into fire. We don't need cybernetics to become monsters. Just purpose, no mercy, no sleep, just the hunt. At some point, the Zarn stopped sending scouts. They began sending fleets, not to attack, to monitor. To watch, to see if the stories were true, because now the fear wasn't just about losing a skirmish. It was about waking the thing that never stopped moving, the predator that never slept, the apex species that didn't fear death, only failure. It wasn't the bullets that terrified them. It was that we never ran out, not of ammo, not of rage, not of time. It started with whispers in the jungles of Yilgar 3. The Zarn patrols moved in standard formation, scanning for movement, heat, and sound. Jungle warfare was nothing new to them. They had hunted apex beasts across half a dozen worlds. But this planet was different, not because of the terrain, or the air, or the local fauna. It was different because humans had been here. And they were still here. The Zarn had landed after the orbital strike, expecting the colony to be in ruins, the survivors either vaporized or cowering, but the jungle was quiet, too quiet, not dead. Just waiting. The first night, a scout disappeared. The others assumed he'd wandered off or gotten sloppy. These things happened, but when the second one vanished, after the squad leader had clearly issued a close formation order, they began to worry. Tracks led nowhere. Heat signatures vanished into cold spots. Even their advanced senses were confused. Something about the environment didn't match previous scans, as if it had been manipulated. On the second night, they found the first body. Hanging upside down by a vine, throat slit, no gunfire, no evidence of a struggle, no noise. The third night, half the squad didn't wake up. The survivors told stories of red eyes in the trees, of rhythmic, almost ritualistic sounds in the dark. Not weapons, tapping, echoes, a psychological assault of unknown origin. The Zarn, masters of the hunt, had become prey, and the fear spread. It wasn't just Yilg or three. On half a dozen fronts, reports began to surface. Stories of human operatives moving through terrain like shadows, lying motionless for hours, even days, watching, waiting, setting traps with the patience of death itself. One alien commander, General Katoril of the Zenthari Combine, recounted a battle on the ice world of Marnock. His elite scouts had tracked what they thought was a lone human sniper. They flanked his position, moved in slowly, undetected. Their approach was perfect. The human was already gone. In his place was a pressure mine and a tracker beacon. The moment they stepped forward, half his squad disappeared in a flash of ice and flame. But it wasn't the trap that broke him. It was what came after. Over the next 72 hours, the rest of his unit was hunted, individually, one by one, no sleep, no pattern, just the constant gnawing fear that every shadow held a Terran, every sound was a trick, every moment of rest would be their last. He transmitted a single phrase to his command ship before extraction: they wait, and they watch, and they never stop. The phrase began to circulate across alien fleets and command centers, not as official doctrine. No one wanted to admit fear, but as superstition, a legend, a warning. Alien soldiers began requesting extra surveillance drones, night vision upgrades, sleep aids, morale boosters. They were terrified not of being fought, but of being hunted. Because when humans fought, they didn't charge like beasts. They stalked. They wore down their prey. They disappeared for days, then returned with precise, brutal fury. And when alien soldiers were captured alive, interrogated for what they'd seen, they didn't talk about ships or tech or tactics. They talked about silence. About traps they never saw, about soldiers with painted faces, unmoving for hours in sub-zero conditions, about the moment you thought you were safe, just before the shot rang out. Humans were no longer seen as prey, nor even as warriors. They had become the forest, the darkness, the unseen breath behind your neck. You don't fight that. You don't challenge it. You pray it never finds you. The Zarn High Command was no longer amused. What began as a curious series of failed hunts had escalated into something they could no longer ignore. Dozens of elite operatives lost, Black Ops teams vanishing mid-transmission, entire strike units sent into combat only for their signals to go dark. No distress, no retreat, just silence. So they turned to science. The Zarn were predators, but they were not without intelligence. Their empire had prospered for millennia because of their cold precision, not just brute strength. And so they summoned the finest minds from across the Orion Arm: xenobiologists, neuroanatomists, war psychologists, artificial cognition engineers. All were tasked with one goal: to understand the human threat. They brought in a prisoner, a live specimen, captured after a grueling siege on New Ceres. The man had been awake for nearly 4 days, bleeding from multiple wounds, and still managed to kill 2 guards before sedation. He shouldn't have been able to stand, and yet, when the restraints loosened by accident, he nearly broke the table. That was their first clue. Human biology didn't obey the limits. A Zarkari neural analyst dissected his vitals, comparing baseline readings to over 1,000 known species. What she found didn't make sense. During pain, his brain activity increased. During sleep deprivation, his focus, according to EEG readings, sharpened instead of diminishing. When shown a video loop of his squad being ambushed, the man's adrenaline spiked nearly instantly. But instead of panic, he became calmer, breathing more evenly. His brain entered what the machines labeled a sustained hypervigilant state, a condition the AI monitor flagged as both combat ready and emotionally grounded. That was impossible. No species could maintain that level of stress without breaking down. But humans didn't break. They thrived under pressure. Sleep was the next subject. Dozens of test logs reviewed across battlefields showed humans operating for days on end. When they did rest, it was in short bursts, often while standing, crouching, or mid-transport. And when true sleep wasn't possible, humans used a cocktail of stimulants, breathing rhythms, even brief hallucination, filled meditative states that somehow recharged them enough to keep going. The Zarn had seen this before among war beasts genetically engineered for suicide missions, but humans weren't designed. They evolved this, and worse, they volunteered for it. What creature chooses this? One of the AI constructs asked. What being seeks out pain, deprivation, and exhaustion, and calls it duty? They began to understand the deeper terror. Humans weren't just physically durable, they were mentally unstable in a way that defied galactic norms. Most sentient species broke under emotional trauma, not humans. Humans processed it, carried it, wore it like armor. When they lost comrades, they didn't collapse. They got angry. When ambushed, they didn't freeze. They adapted. When outnumbered, they didn't surrender. They made you pay. A captured data log from a Terran fireteam confirmed this. We're not here to survive. We're here to make sure they don't. The analysts had to admit it. These creatures weren't prey. They weren't even predators in the traditional sense. They were obsessive problem solvers, and war was just a problem. No sleep, fine. They'll run on adrenaline, no victory. They'll make you bleed anyway. No way out, they'll blow a hole through. By the end of the study, the conclusion was unanimous. No species known to the Zarn or the Council of Predatory Intelligence could match human resilience under extended duress. Not because humans were immune to damage, but because they simply refused to stop. This wasn't a flaw. This was design. And the question that chilled every predator scientist in the room wasn't how do we defeat them? It was, who the hell made them like this? The war reached a tipping point on the frozen moon of Kepler 442 CB. It was a mineral, rich rock, barely worth the blood spilled on it. But strategically, it was the last choke point before the Zarn could push into the Terran inner belt. They believed a swift assault would break our back, shatter our morale, and force Earth to surrender. They didn't understand what desperation awakens in a species born to endure. The Zarn launched with full force 4 capital ships, 70,000 soldiers, automated drop barges, and an elite division known as the Talons of Korth, famed across the Orion Arm for their psychological warfare and battlefield dominance. They outgunned the human garrison 5-1. On paper, the battle should have lasted hours. It lasted 12 days. The first day, they took the surface outposts. They met light resistance, due light. It confused them. The humans fought, but not to win. They fought to delay. Every trench collapsed on timers. Every path deeper into the base was mined, choked with booby traps and kinetic kills. It wasn't retreat. It was invitation. The Talons advanced, confident. They didn't notice how the sky dimmed with artificial smoke, how the air began to chill unnaturally, how the temperature dropped by over 20 degrees in the second night. The atmosphere was being manipulated, slowly, carefully, by the humans not to kill but to suffocate comfort. Day 3, their supply lines went silent. Drop. Pods missed coordinates. Drones went blind in the haze. Zarn units began reporting strange audio frequencies, barely audible human voices just on the edge of detection, whispering, breathing, weaving confusion into the soldiers' already stressed minds. Many thought it was a glitch. Others began to suspect the humans had embedded sonic warfare into the environment. They were right. By day 5, sleep deprivation began to erode discipline. Zarn squads turned on each other in panic after accidental noise triggers, thinking they'd been found. More units began reporting movement in the fog, not big attacks, small ones, surgical, 1 or 2 humans at a time, appearing and vanishing, always at night, always when they thought they were safe. Precision gunfire, blades in the dark, drones turning against their handlers. It wasn't a war, it was a dissection. By day 8, morale among the Zarn collapsed. Half of the Talons of Korth were lost. Their command center was compromised. The human defenders, outnumbered and low on munitions, had retaken 2 positions using hand weapons and scavenged explosives. A single fire team reportedly infiltrated the Zarn's orbital supply barge and rigged the ship's life, support to fail just as it re-entered combat orbit. 3,000 Zarn troops aboard. None made it to the surface. On day 9, the humans stopped attacking. That's what scared the Zarn most. They expected a final assault, but instead, silence. Hours passed. Then a day, then 2, no movement, no contact, nothing but the wind and snow. That's when the final blow landed. Human PSYOPs units activated a global broadcast. Live recordings from inside the Zarn's own barracks, caught on hacked helmet cams. Footage of soldiers breaking down, screaming in dreams, begging not to sleep. The humans didn't need more weapons. They used truth as a weapon. The message was simple. We don't need to kill you. You'll do it for us. By day 12, the Zarn began a full retreat. Not ordered, instinctive, soldiers ran from shadows. Commanders sealed themselves in drop pods. The Talons of Korth ceased to exist as a unit. They weren't defeated in combat. They were unmade. That was when the other empires began to see it too. The whispered name for humanity was spreading beyond the Zarn, sleepless death. Because when we fight, we don't stop, we don't break, and when we vanish, that's when you should be most afraid. In the aftermath of the battle for Kepler 442 CB, something changed across the galaxy. It wasn't political, it wasn't even strategic, it was psychological. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the predator species, the ones who prided themselves on domination, hunting, and conquest, began drafting defensive treaties. Not because of a human invasion, not because Earth had unleashed a doomsday weapon, but because the nightmares wouldn't stop. Veterans of the Zarn campaign were returning home in disgrace, most unable to serve again. Their minds were fractured, sleep eluded them, they talked to walls, jumped at shadows, and panicked when lights flickered. Medical scans showed no parasites, no external damage. The wounds were internal, emotional, mental, existential. Some spoke of red eyes in the dark. Others mentioned rhythmic heartbeats that didn't come from any living body. One clawed at the walls of a medical facility until his fingers bled, screaming about the humans who never blinked. They had stared at him across the battlefield. Not with anger, not with hatred, with calm, unshakable, cold calm. It was something the Zarn could not understand, should not have feared, and yet they did. The incident forced the Galactic Council to convene an emergency session on Earth's classification. Originally designated as a developing world, barely spacefaring, humanity had been seen as more curiosity than threat. That illusion had shattered. Now, some proposed that humans be classified under an ancient, nearly forgotten designation. Tier Zeta, psychologically hazardous species. There were only two such species in recorded galactic history. Both had gone extinct, not because they were destroyed, but because they self-destructed under the weight of their own evolutionary aggression. Humanity, however, showed no signs of collapse. Instead, their soldiers rotated out of the war zones, slept for a day or two, and returned to duty, smiling, focused, determined. Entire divisions trained under these conditions voluntarily. The Terran military had even begun designing programs to push soldiers into pre-psychological tolerance states, training them to thrive under conditions that would break others. The real horror, it wasn't genetic engineering. It wasn't cybernetic enhancement, it was mindset. The Council's scientists eventually published a report titled Human Operational Persistence Under Neurocognitive Stress Conditions. It outlined in clinical, sterile detail what alien generals already feared. Humans did not require traditional sleep patterns. They did not rely on emotional clarity. They functioned best not in balance, but in imbalance. In chaos, in stress, in war, this wasn't an advantage. It was an anomaly, a flaw in the evolutionary blueprint that somehow became a weapon. The Council debated sanctions, quarantine, genetic restrictions. But none of it would stop what was already loose in the galaxy, because it wasn't just soldiers. It was doctors pulling 30-hour shifts on hospital ships. It was engineers fixing reactors during meteor storms with their hands burned and bleeding. It was children surviving in the wilderness after colony failures. It was civilians choosing to stay behind so others could escape. Other species didn't know what to make of this. They called it madness. Or martyrdom. Humans called it something else, responsibility. And as word spread, the fear transformed. It was no longer just dread of battle. It was dread of the idea of humanity, sleepless, merciless, endless. The greatest predator isn't the one who bites hardest, or who sees farthest in the dark. It's the one who never stops chasing you, who doesn't need rest, who doesn't forgive, who won't let you disappear into silence or time. Because one day, long after the battles fade and the dust settles, you'll be lying awake in your chamber, surrounded by stillness, and you'll hear it. Footsteps, breathing, not close, not yet, but coming. Always coming.